The wind had started changing directions by late morning, not just shifting, but rolling thick air folding in from the Gulf in layers that pressed low against the tarmac. Heat shimmered up off concrete in waves, blending with salt spray and the soft thrum of engines on standby. At the outer edge of the flight line, Jessie stood beside a forklift crate labeled for spare fuel hoses, her clipboard tucked under one arm, her gloves looped to her belt. She wasn't on the roster, and everyone knew it. That made her invisible. 2 hangars down, a flight crew in bright vests circled a modified recon turboprop. The airframe bore fresh stencils. The nose sensor was clean. The pilot inside was already buckled, running checklists over headset. A junior loadmaster tapped on a tablet, then motioned toward the fuel truck. This launch had been briefed 2 hours ago. Jessie wasn't invited. She didn't ask. A breeze caught the edge of her overshirt and flapped it against her waist. She adjusted nothing. The wind had weight now, the kind that didn't just move fabric but held it there, dragging it. Jessie glanced toward the low clouds pushing in from the south. That was the second pressure drop in less than 1 hour. The system offshore had built faster than the models called for. She knew it the same way she knew how to trace drift from memory without needing a printout to say so. The operations tent flapped at its corners as 2 officers emerged and crossed toward the comms van. Both wore sharp-cornered uniforms, collars dark with sweat. One of them, Lieutenant Raymond, passed Jessie without a glance. His hand still held a printout folded twice. Jessie caught the heading in blue ink Flight Path Alpha. Confirmed launch. That made it official. They were sending the recon team into the spiral band with 2 models 3 hours behind real-time pressure. She had drawn a correction arc last night. It sat now on her workstation, pencil marks fading on old thermal paper, annotated with crosswinds and curlbacks near buoy cluster 184. No one had asked to see it. She hadn't offered. There was no route for that anymore. Inside the hangar behind her, Saltwind sat under a rusted truss and canvas sling, her floats streaked with grime, her flaps pinned open. The amphibian hadn't flown since Jessie was pulled from flight status last year. She had defied an abort call mid-storm. The command called it a refusal to comply. She had called it finishing the mission, but no one asked for her version. They just cleared her badge, reassigned her to logistics support, and never used her name again. A loudspeaker cracked from the control van. "Recon crew, final systems check. Prepare for taxi." Jessie turned her eyes toward the runway. The turboprop's props began to spin, slow at first, then blurring into wind. Ground crews backed away. The aircraft rolled toward the painted line, engines humming louder. She watched the plane make its turn, nose lifting slightly as it lined up for departure. A voice behind her spoke in passing, clipped and casual. "Hey, Jessie, you good for bay inventory at 1400? It was Sergeant Colby, clipboard in hand, halfway through the shade line. "Yeah," she said, and that was all. He nodded once and kept walking. Her gloves swayed once against her belt loop, unnoticed. The plane lifted off 5 minutes later. It climbed slow. Engines throttled against crosswind, tail adjusting in micro movements Jessie could feel even from the ground. She watched until the fuselage tilted into the clouds, the gray belly vanishing into thickening mist. No cheers? No comms chatter over loudspeaker. Just quiet protocol. Inside the operations tent, a screen flickered once. A red dot blinked on the northeast quadrant. Status airborne. Time 0923. Jessie stood in the same spot, her clipboard untouched. By 1000, the wind had picked up. Storm bands pushed whitecaps nearly to shore. Rain fell in streaks, then pulled sideways before it reached the ground. The comms van door slammed once, caught by wind, then closed. Inside, 3 technicians monitored telemetry, voice relay, and beacon sync. One of them frowned at the waveform. "Are we still holding altimeter on Tango 7?" he asked. The second tech leaned forward. "We were..." They should have pinged by now. Jessie didn't move from her crate. The wind changed direction again. She heard nothing but static. The screen inside the van showed a slow blink once every 4 seconds. Then nothing. The tech keyed the console again. Alpha 2. Confirm drift track. Repeat. Confirm track update. Silence. A tone repeated once, then stopped. The officer inside the van straightened. Comms dropped. The senior tech leaned in. No. Full loss. We didn't get a beacon ping. The red dot blinked twice more, then vanished. Jessie turned toward the ops tent without needing to check the monitor. She had felt the wind shift, heard the static change pitch. The system was gone, not offline. Gone. Inside the tent, voices began to rise. Someone said reboot. Someone else asked for the backup stream. She already knew. Her clipboard slipped slightly under her arm as she turned away from the crate. She didn't speak, didn't move fast. She just looked once more at the sky, at the trailing clouds curling back toward the Gulf. Behind her, a tech's voice broke through quiet. Recon is off network. Repeat, recon is off. We have no signal. Then silence. Then the last 3 words Jessie would hear before anyone else understood what they meant. Signal lost. The chart was still on her desk, curled at the edges. The pencil markings smudged faintly from where she'd tapped her thumb over one drift ring too many times. Jessie unrolled it again and pressed the corners flat with the heel of her hand. No one had touched it but her. The collapse spiral was faint, but it was there, widening at the lower pressure line just southwest of where the beacon had cut out. The models on the base's network didn't show it because they hadn't adjusted for local eddy behavior off the shelf. The recon aircraft hadn't broken up, it had ditched and it had drifted. Outside, the radio channel was still looping status attempts. Alpha 2, check signal. Alpha 2, respond. Silence. The base had already turned inward, shifting toward paperwork, logs, and satellite access priority. A post-incident board was forming. Jessie stepped out of the back office, chart still in hand, and crossed toward the comms shelter. A junior officer stood beside the comms rack, reading through a flight log with one hand while sipping from a thermal cup with the other. Jessie held up the chart. Calm. Direct. There's a spiral forming near buoy 184. If they ditched before full power loss, they'd drift here, she said, tapping the arc. Collapse currents could have pulled them south of the projected loss zone. We should launch a visual. The officer didn't look up. You're not on flight, he replied, already setting his cup down to adjust a dial. We don't have search assets cleared until the advisory drops. That's command's call. They're not lost, Jessie said, holding the paper closer. They're just not where the model says they should be. He shrugged. Then the model's wrong. But no one's flying till we get airspace green. He walked away without taking the chart. Jessie folded it once, tight and even, and slid it under her elbow as she turned toward the north side of the compound. The wind had pushed hard inland now, making the rain feel like thread lines pulled sideways. The tarp line on the far hangar rippled like a broken banner. Her boots found the familiar groove in the gravel that led behind the secondary generator shed. Saltwind's hangar sat unlit, padlocked, and quiet. The rust hadn't reached the lock hinge yet. Jessie reached into her back pocket and pulled out the bolt cutters she'd used 2 years ago to break open a stuck fuel cage during a power outage. She had never returned them. One clean bite, and the lock dropped. The hangar door gave a shudder as she pushed it open. Saltwind was still there. The floats were dusted with grime and streaked from roof leaks. The right flap was down 1/2 inch, still slack from the last time the cable pulley slipped. Jessie stepped inside, slid the door closed behind her, and clicked the overhead work lamp once. It flickered on. She unrolled the drift chart on the wing surface and pinned the corner with a wrench. Then she moved through the motions, not fast, but deliberate. She pulled the engine tarp off by hand, wiped the inside edges with a rag, checked for nesting. Nothing. Good. The auxiliary tank line was still capped. She rotated the prop once, slowly, checking for free turn. 1, 2, 3. Still good tension. The fuel bladder had been dry stored with stabilizer. She opened the valve and listened for the shift. No bubbling. The lines were clean. Her canvas flight bag sat in the rear cargo shelf, folded under a sun-bleached towel. She pulled it free, checked the inside for water seal, and laid it in the co-pilot seat. In the side pouch, her brother's old kneeboard clipboard was still folded, with a stub pencil wedged into the strap. She clicked her headset into the left jack, adjusted the yoke trim, and slid into the pilot seat. Her boots left faint streaks on the floorboard. Outside, the rain picked up. She could hear it on the hangar roof, a dull rhythmic hiss. She opened the side panel and checked the nav battery. It flickered once, then held. She keyed the startup switch and watched the panel light. No fault codes, no voltage dip. She reached up, checked the magneto, adjusted mixture, and let the engine breathe twice before bringing throttle forward. The hum started low, then leveled. It wasn't graceful, but it ran. She clipped the drift chart to the dash, just to the right of the altimeter, and marked her intended vector in red. The ink dragged slightly, the pencil line over water-warped paper. She didn't fix it. She just pressed the tip again and finished the arc. Saltwind shuddered as she released the brake and eased the throttle forward. The hangar door was still partway open. She pushed it wider with the side strut, slow and deliberate, until it caught in the wind and slammed once against the metal catch. The rain sheeted sideways now, streaking across the glass as she taxied forward. The floats hissed slightly against the wet concrete. She eased out toward the access strip. Light off, transponder cold, radio silent. No one called her name. She didn't need clearance. She wasn't on the board. As Saltwind turned into the wind, the pencil chart trembled slightly on the dash. Jessie tapped it once with the back of her finger. She kept the throttle at idle. Her pencil was tucked behind her ear now, just like her brother used to do. She reached for the flaps. Rain slid down the windshield in long diagonal lines. She brought her hand back to the yoke and settled it there. Saltwind moved forward alone. Saltwind cleared the coastal airstrip with a long, uneven climb, the floats dragging in the crosswind before stabilizing. Jessie kept her eyes forward, one hand steady on the throttle, the other adjusting the trim by half increments. The storm edge had reached inland already, its outer arms stretching black across the waterline. She had climbed into weather before, but not like this. Not with no return frequency and no alternate strip. Still, the airframe held true. The vibration was familiar. Not dangerous. Just demanding. She knew the feel of this aircraft. The storm could shake it, but it couldn't fool her hands. Below, the Gulf rolled with the weight of something larger than itself. Jessie dropped altitude as the cloud ceiling closed in. The instruments blinked once, lost sync, then came back. She flew low and wide, following the line she had marked the night before. Her pencil chart sat clipped beside the altimeter, fluttering slightly from cabin draft. The paper had smudged at the corner where she'd pressed too hard, drawing a spiral. That spiral was now below her, manifesting in real time as a subtle curve in the foam line near the water's surface. The radar skipped again. She ignored it, not because she didn't trust the system, but because the system wasn't made for what she was doing. This wasn't a straight-line run. It was an interpretation, drift math, water memory. She flew by eye and air pressure, the same way her brother used to teach her out over shrimp nets and satellite blind zones. Wind hit the port side hard, pushing her half a wing's width off course. Jessie corrected with rudder only, eyes scanning ahead. The water below was no longer uniform. Patches of oil and foam mixed with slicks that twisted unnaturally. A curl of dye unfurled to the southwest, faint, almost gray, but unmistakable to someone who had seen dropped markers disperse in heavy rain. That meant someone had tried to be seen. She descended by 10 degrees. The rain struck harder now, not in drops, but in streaks, long and fast across the windshield. The wipers held for 2 passes, then struggled, She flicked them off. Better to see through blur than fight mechanical lag. Salt wind rocked in the wind shear. Jessie reached up, flipped the landing lights on, and narrowed her focus to a quarter-mile ahead. Her fingers flexed once, then reset on the yoke. The pencil behind her ear had stained her temple. She wiped it off with the back of her glove. The debris field emerged slowly, pieces rising and falling between swells. A floating ration crate, cracked open and trailing packets. A panel board, half scorched, its edges torn. Then something bright, a hard flash, red-orange against slate-green. She leveled the aircraft. The flare came again. Not smoke, not drifting. Fired. Someone was alive down there. Jessie ran a quick check of wind vector, stall buffer, and sea state. It wasn't good. The waves were rising fast, peaking with no rhythm. The storm had pulled tide and countertide into a fight, and the surface showed it. But her floats were sealed. The gear was retracted. She had brought salt wind down in worse than this, though never for someone else. She adjusted flaps to half, then full, altimeter at 200. The engine struggled, catching low at idle. She bumped it once with throttle, coaxing it back. There was no room for stutter now. The raft became visible. 3 heads, one of them moving slowly, reaching upward. Jessie angled toward the lee of the swell, trying to find a shadow of calm. The radio hissed, then died. She didn't touch it. She took one breath, checked pressure, adjusted trim. The waves bucked beneath her now, not chaotic, but constant, no safe place. Only the right place. She brought her hand to the throttle. The pencil chart flapped beside her. The die slick curved to the east. The raft rode high on a swell, one man leaning over the edge with a flare still lit in his hand. Jessie didn't blink. She pushed the throttle forward and dropped toward the waves. Salt wind struck the waves hard, the floats slamming into the surface with a groan deep enough to rattle through the frame. Jessie braced instinctively, keeping her grip steady on the yoke as spray covered the windshield in one thick sheet. The aircraft bounced once, nose tipping forward, then settled with a shuddering grind as the swell passed underneath. She worked the rudder to bring the fuselage into wind shadow, angling slightly against the next wave to stabilize. It was not a clean landing. It was functional. That was enough. The raft was 30 meters off her port side, caught in the cross-current and listing badly. She could see 2 figures now, one waving. The other slumped. The third was face down but moving, one arm hooked through the webbing. The flare had gone out, but the smoke still trailed thin and dark over the surface. Jessie unlatched the hatch, the wind catching it as she pushed it wide. She unclipped a coil of line from behind the co-pilot seat and tossed the anchor end out across the gap. It missed. She reeled it in, coiled fast, and threw again. This time, it landed across the raft's side. One of the men grabbed it, tied a quick loop through the outer ring, and nodded. Jessie dug her boots into the frame, pulled hand over hand until the raft scraped against the float's side. The waves surged again. Salt wind rocked hard, but she held trim. The first man hauled himself into the hatch without help. His uniform was soaked through, face cut across the jaw, eyes too wide but focused. He dropped to his knees and reached back. The second came slower, injured leg, teeth clenched. Jessie reached down and pulled his arm over her shoulder, bracing as he half fell into the footwell. The last one didn't move. She dropped to her stomach and reached down the float edge, both arms extended. The man in the raft didn't respond. His harness was caught. She leaned further, rain blinding her, and grabbed the chest strap. He coughed once. That was all. It took her both hands and a twist of the line to free him. She dragged him over the float edge, inch by inch, until his weight shifted and they both collapsed inward, half into the cockpit, half across the side panel. She gritted her teeth and heaved once more, bringing him fully inside. His eyes opened, blood in one, and he looked at her like she wasn't real. No one spoke. The raft was already drifting backward, its side collapsing as a wave pulled the remains out from under it. Jessie grabbed the hatch, slammed it shut, and sealed the lever. Water dripped down her sleeves. The cabin smelled of salt, oil, and human effort. She moved fast, climbing back into the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the checklist she no longer needed. Outside, the swells were higher. Taxiing would be a fight. The three men were slumped across the rear bench and the floor, breathing but broken. One of them still clutched a waterlogged medbag against his chest, the label unreadable, the fabric torn. Jessie keyed the magneto. The engine whined once, caught, then spun to life with a low roar that barely cut through the sound of rain on metal. She pushed the throttle forward and eased into taxi. Saltwind bucked hard, nose lifting slightly. She used rudder to steer with the swell, riding low between the crests. There was no takeoff zone, no heading, just space between troughs. The floats dragged hard, water pushing into the struts. Jessie leaned forward, pressed her hand against the yoke, and trimmed out 2 degrees. She checked the engine gauge. The temperature was climbing just below red. Still stable. Not for long. She fed throttle again. The stall warning chirped once, angry and high. The aircraft pulled left. She corrected. A wave hit broadside, lifting them 2 meters and dropping them hard. The floats slammed, skipped. She held. The pencil chart fluttered on the dash. She didn't look at it. She gritted her teeth, nudged flaps to takeoff position, and pushed the throttle to maximum. The floats groaned, water peeling off in heavy sheets. The airspeed held just under target. She kept going. The nose tipped up once too soon. She held it level. Saltwind rose 1/2 meter, dropped, then rose again. This time, it held. The wheels lifted off the waterline just long enough to catch air. The wind caught them. Jessie pulled gently, keeping the lift smooth, not forcing it. The stall light flickered, then died. The aircraft rose unevenly, tail low, speed barely at margin. Below, the water rolled back into chaos. She checked her climb angle, adjusted for the headwind, and held altitude at 300. The radio was still dead. That didn't matter. In the rear view, she caught one of the survivors blinking against the light, his hand curled around the seat rail. He didn't speak, just held on. The medbag sat between them, leaking a faint trail of water across the floor. Jessie looked ahead, eyes fixed on the edge of the storm wall. Saltwind shuddered again. She adjusted trim, checked pressure, and angled toward home. The airframe creaked once but stayed whole. She never looked back. The pencil chart fluttered once more against the dash as she flew into the gray. The radar tech in the side trailer leaned back in his chair and rubbed at his eyes. The screens had been quiet for an hour, just storm noise and stray echoes off wave tops. He was logging weather anomalies when something blinked once in the corner quadrant. Low altitude. No squawk. No signal. Just a skin return barely riding the curve of the terrain mask. He tapped the screen. "We've got a return," he said, voice flat at first. Then he zoomed. The vector was inland, below 400 feet, dragging across the approach line with an angle that didn't make sense for a recon drone or drifting wreckage. Could be debris, someone offered behind him. But the tech didn't answer. He was already narrowing the trace, watching as the contact stabilized into a shape. He pulled up the terrain overlay. The approach was angled from southwest vector, uncontrolled, no ID. But the transponder had blinked once, just long enough to register a tailcode faded, but real. Saltwind. He stood up. "We've got an incoming aircraft. Manual approach, no comms. It's her." Inside the operations tent, someone dropped a pen. Another leaned forward to check the monitor. No one spoke. Outside, the storm hadn't fully cleared, but the worst had passed. The sky hung low, heavy and dark, with rain still breaking across the concrete in gusts. The wind was shifting north now, pushing wet branches across the chain-link fences and tossing debris into the drainage ditches. No one had expected movement from that direction. Certainly not from a Cessna that wasn't even listed as operational. The first visual came from a guard near the perimeter, a low shout, then movement down the line. Saltwind came in with her nose heavy, floats slicing water off the flooded access strip. She hit hard, bounced once, then settled, nose pulling left as Jessie fought for control. The fuselage groaned as she braked, water kicking up behind her in long sheets. She stayed with the aircraft until it stopped fully, nose pointed at the edge of the runway, tail sagging just above the rising puddle line. One of the floats was clearly leaking. No lights flashed, no engines stayed running. The prop spun down slow, blades clicking to a stop. No one on the ground moved. The hatch opened. Jessie stepped out onto the float with both hands gripping the side strut. Her flight suit was soaked, sleeves dark, hair tied back and plastered to her neck. She didn't look up. She dropped to one knee and pulled the hatch wider. Inside, motion. One of the recon crew stirred. A medic sprinted forward, slipping once on the wet pavement. Two more followed, hauling a stretcher. One of the crew was half conscious, leaning against the interior wall. Another pushed him forward. They helped each other, boots dragging across the float into waiting arms. The last one stood under his own power but stumbled twice. When he reached the stretcher, he looked back over his shoulder at Jessie and said something none of the medics caught. "She found us." He didn't shout it. He didn't cry. It was just a flat statement, half a whisper. But it landed hard. Everyone heard it. Saltwind's tail number was visible now, streaked with dirt and storm grime, but legible. A junior officer took a step toward the aircraft, then stopped. A ground crewman held his headset without putting it on. Jessie didn't speak to either of them. She stepped down slowly, boots squelching as they hit wet pavement. Her left knee buckled slightly, but she didn't fall. In her right hand was her logbook, soaked through, the cover soft and dark from water. She walked to the rear of the aircraft, checked the tail flap once, and nodded to no one. Inside the cockpit, the pencil chart still fluttered against the dash. It had held the entire flight. A medic placed a blanket over one of the rescued men. Another began checking vitals. One called for oxygen. Jessie didn't approach. She stepped back to the wing, climbed halfway up, and sat. Her head was down, elbows on knees, flight gloves beside her on the aluminum skin. Wind moved the edge of her sleeve. She didn't wipe her face. She didn't remove her headset. She looked out over the field and the dark water pooling near the drainage ditch. No one asked how she had flown. No one said her name. But no one left. Behind her, the storm started to break apart over the Gulf. Pale light pushed against the clouds from the east. In the quiet, Jessie exhaled once and reached for the gloves beside her. She didn't put them on. She just held them. By the time the final press drone lifted off, Jessie had already cleared the fuel line and returned to the far hangar. She hadn't stood for photographs. She hadn't been named in the mission brief. The rescued crew was stable and listed under medevac rotation. Their vitals had been filed, tagged, and archived. Jessie's name appeared once scrawled at the bottom of a handwritten flight log. Ink pressed hard enough to score the paper. Saltwind's floats had been drained and braced. The engine had cooled beneath the tarp she'd tied down herself. Rain still lingered on the edge of the concrete, darkening the cracks and crevices along the hangar floor. Jessie moved quietly through it, boots echoing with each step. In her hand was a rag soaked in solvent. She scrubbed the leading edge of the wing, removing salt grit in patient circles. The pencil chart was still taped to the cockpit glass, flapping now and then in the breeze when the side hatch cracked open. She hadn't taken it down. The tape had held through the storm, and it would hold now. She reached in and flattened the paper against the dash with her fingertips, smoothing the wrinkles along the margin where she had drawn the drift spiral that morning before launch. Behind her, the base was shifting gears again. A fresh team arrived with new relief pallets. The command structure was reassigning sectors and checking satellite overlays. No one stopped her. No one interfered. She moved through the quiet, like part of the building. Her kneeboard, now dry, sat beside her patched flight bag on the tool shelf. The name etched on its underside was still visible, her brother's, scratched in years ago. She picked it up, flipped it open, and slid a freshly sharpened pencil into the strap. Then she set it down again, without a sound. The liaison from command had arrived an hour earlier. She had waited beside the hangar door, holding a file in one hand and a laminated badge in the other. The offer was simple: reinstatement, quiet and retroactive, full access, with no press. Jessie had listened, nodded once, and looked past her toward the sky, where the wind still curled over the bay in slow arcs. She hadn't refused. She had only said one sentence: "They're alive, that's enough." Now, she scrubbed at a patch of dried fuel along the fuselage, fingers raw from fabric friction. The grit gave way slowly, revealing the original sheen beneath the dirt. She stood back once to check the tail angle. The float still needed sanding. One would have to be resealed. That would take a few days, maybe longer. The tech who had flagged her chart young, quiet, always watching, approached from the service bay. He didn't say anything, just picked up a rag and began working on the opposite wing. They didn't speak. Their rhythm found its own pace. Every few minutes, he'd glance over at her hands, watching the method, matching it. A new No AA model upload had appeared on the network earlier that morning. No attribution, just an update to the drift correction protocol, based on a composite of observed deviation from planned vectors. Jessie had reviewed it. The curvature matched her pencil line within 1 degree. It was already being folded into next season's guidance systems. Her name wasn't listed. That was fine. Saltwind's nose had been marked with a strip of gray tape, no stencil, no badge, just one word written in black marker. Verified. She hadn't written it. Someone else had. At the edge of the windscreen, her backup flare sat in the side pocket, unused. The waterproof pouch was still sealed. She ran a thumb over the casing once, then let it be. Later, as the sun broke briefly through the last of the storm's outer wall, Jessie stepped up into the cockpit one more time. She adjusted the chart on the glass, pressed the corners flat again. Then she reached for the kneeboard. The pencil slid free without resistance. She tucked it into the case, zipped it shut, and clipped it to the flight bag. She took one long look at the instrument panel. The engine was quiet. Everything inside was still. Then she stepped back onto the wing, climbed down to the hangar floor, and walked toward the open doors. The wind came through in a slow cross breeze, warm now, pulling strands of hair loose behind her ears. She didn't look back. She didn't speak. Saltwind wouldn't fly tomorrow. That was fine. Jessie was never looking for recognition. She didn't break the rules for glory. She flew because no one else would, because she knew the storm better than anyone, and because she believed those lives were still out there, waiting to be found. Her story isn't loud. It's not filled with speeches or celebration. But that's what makes it powerful. Sometimes strength looks like a quiet decision in a dark hangar. Sometimes courage is a pencil mark on a forgotten chart. And sometimes the person no one listens to is the only one who sees the truth. If Jessie's story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect. Who in your world leads with quiet conviction, whose work goes unseen but never wavers? Let us know in the comments, and follow for more stories that honor the quiet ones who never stop showing up.